Hello again. I thought I'd record another behind the scenes podcast. This would be number two. I just got back from being in Uganda for a couple of weeks. Now, first thing, it was supposed to be a volunteer project, but it really wasn't. It was more of a kind of ecotourism once I got there. But anyway, um, I went because it was an opportunity to see mountain gorillas. And in fact, I did have a couple of hikes into different parks. There were two different parks that we went to see the gorillas, and one of them was the Magahinga. I'm terrible at pronouncing these things. National Park, and then we went to Bwindi Impenetrable National Park, and then finally we had a final trek to see chimpanzees, and that actually just going back through. Oh, that was Queen Elizabeth National Park, which was interesting because it was a few days after the Queen had died, and at the area where you drive into the park, so you need to register and have a permit and all that kind of thing. There was a portrait of the Queen with a black edge all around and a candle. A lit candle in front of it. So that was quite a nice touch, speaking as a Brit, as a POM, to see how Her Majesty was being remembered there. Anyway, what I wanted to talk about in this behind the scenes was just talk a little bit about what I found, what I experienced. So first of all, I went to Uganda because, it was a volunteer project. I had also been looking at seeing the gorillas in Rwanda, because where the gorillas are, they're down in the southwest of Uganda, and I don't know how your geography is, but Rwanda is basically on that southern border, and then you have the Democratic Republic of Congo to the west of them. Now, DCR has had some violence and all sorts of problems in recent years. Rwanda has also suffered a little bit, although that wasn't why I went. In the end, I went because I thought I was doing a volunteer project, and there was some involvement with local schools, and we did plant some saplings, but it was very few. It was more of a kind of nod to the kind of conservation of the environment. So a little bit frustrating, personally, that side of it. But it was good to meet a lot of people. I met the regional program manager of the gorilla organization, which has people like Leonardo DiCaprio. I'm going to get these. I need to check my notes for the the other people who are involved. But there are some quite well-known people who are involved in that organization, and they're patrons of it. So it does help to fund them. And what they're doing is trying to protect the gorillas. They do take steps against poaching, and I recorded another podcast about poaching because I met with an ex-poacher and his son. I'm not going to say any more than that because they're reformed and they're sort of back in the community and very active. So that's good, and I don't want to say anything that would affect them in a negative way at all. But I do strongly believe that if we're going to be serious about conservation, we have to look not only at what's going on with the animals themselves, but also what's going on with the people who live around them, because one of the biggest threats to animals, possibly the biggest threat to animals and the potential extinction of certain species, is man. And we need to understand why we are a threat and take steps to remedy that. So it's definitely a two-pronged aspect of conservation. There's looking at the animals directly and their environment, but also looking at what's happening with the local communities who live in those areas, because that tends to be where the biggest threat comes from. I'm going to talk about going to see the gorillas because I definitely underestimated it. Now, bear in mind that I was there in September, so in Uganda this is the rainy season, and it definitely rains. You get some very heavy thunderstorms. At one point I was in a lodge, and we were on a kind of a high hill, I would call it, rather than a mountain, but we're up in a sort of mountainous area, so we're already up fairly high, I think sort of 2,000 to 3,000 meters above sea level. So that is a height where if you're used to sea level conditions, you really need to acclimatize for a few days because otherwise you're out of breath a lot. And we were definitely, it felt like inside a storm. There was one clap of thunder I remember was extremely loud, and if you had managed to sleep that far in the night, you definitely got woken up. So a lot of rain. Of course, that meant that the conditions were very muddy. Any vegetation was also very slippery. And because we're in a mountainous region down there, I mean, they're mountain gorillas, so that kind of gives you a hint about what to expect. It means that it's not really, yeah, it's hiking, but quite difficult hiking because often we were going up quite steep slopes. They were very slick. And one recommendation, I did it after the first hike because I'd also hurt my back a few weeks before I left, and that hadn't recovered. And I'd on my first hike to see the gorillas, I wasn't quite sure what to expect, so I took a long telephoto, my 100 to 400 mil, which is quite heavy, as well as two camera bodies and a sort of short zoom, wide angle short zoom. And it was the wide angle short that I used most of the time because that worked quite well in low light. We were in forest. Where we found the gorillas on that occasion, we were fairly level, but it had taken us a few hours to get there with a lot of climbing up steep banks, holding on to things. We were given a stick when we started the hike, and I used that a lot to just give me another point on the ground that I could use with one arm. And then my other hand was really there protecting the camera, which I'd slung around the sort of front of me. So my recommendation there, I mean, find out what you can about the environment that you're going into, but the guides that we had were frankly a bit cagey on each of the three hikes about what to expect, and they underplayed it. And I would rather they were straight up, because that I was asking a lot of questions because I really wanted to know what I needed to take. I didn't want to take too much because if they're long hikes, taking a lot of weight isn't a good idea. And obviously, you're carrying water. They generally recommended about 1.5 litres of water, so that's 1.5 kilos straight off before you do anything else. You would need a raincoat because, or something waterproof to put on in case you got involved in a downpour, which did happen on one occasion. But the biggest recommendation is to just hire a porter. Now, at the parks I was at this year, this month, it cost $20 to hire somebody. They would carry things for you, but more importantly, they would help you because they were much more sure-footed than I was. And in fact, I would say, to be fair, probably pretty much everyone in our group, even though there were some younger people, they weren't used to hiking in that environment. And it's very easy to slip. And in fact, one lady in the group, quite young, slipped and broke her wrist. So, the chances of doing yourself an injury were there, and they were not insignificant. So having a porter was very helpful because they just grab a hand and, make sure you're okay. And even on the first trip, but I was being quite stubborn, not a good idea, but I'd really hurt my back. My legs had turned to jelly. So when we first encountered the gorillas, we'd been hiking for, I think, 3 hours and climbing, doing a lot of clambering and climbing. So my back was absolutely burning. My knees were like jelly. And then I actually got down to the photography, which was getting around this group. And they were eating bamboo, but they were on a level area, so we could maneuver around them a little bit, which we couldn't do on the other encounters because we were seeing them on slopes. They were either in the heavy undergrowth or in trees. And basically the guides were having to cut undergrowth away with machetes so that we had somewhere to stand, but often you were standing on a slope on vegetation, and sometimes there wasn't much underneath it, so you had to be very careful of your footing. Often you're in a kind of strange position to get a shot, so it's quite hard on the body. So I would definitely recommend that if you're planning on doing a gorilla trip, make sure you're as fit as you can be, and if you've got any kind of injury, probably think twice about it. At the very least, get one or maybe even two porters to help you to get to see them. So that's the hiking part of it. I think more or less. We were, to be honest, it was dangerous in certain situations. It was quite dangerous. So I'm not going to try and put you off, but just to be straight up, the people selling the trips downplay it, but it definitely was dangerous. So having somebody to look after you is very important. And even on the first trip, what they do on all of these trips. In fact, you'll normally find the guide. So what they'll do, they'll actually send out trackers before you go out. So they tend to go out early in the morning, even though you're leaving quite early. But the trackers will go out first. They'll go back to where they'd seen gorillas the previous day, and then track them. And then there's radio communication between the trackers and the guide leading the group, because you'll be an hour or two or three behind them, and they will help you find the gorillas. So hopefully by the time you leave the entrance to the park, they've already located the gorillas, and then you go to where they are. We were unlucky because the gorillas in our first hike were about as far away as they get from the entrance to the reserve. So often you just hike for under an hour, but I think it was the best part of 3 hours, so it was quite a long hike for us. What then happens is you have a guide, and you also have two people with you who are armed. In our case, they had AK-47, so one's at the front, one's at the back. And the reason for that is that you do occasionally come across buffalo or other animals that can be dangerous. So if they don't back off, the idea is to shoot into the air and scare them off. But those two guys are responsible for the safety of the group. Now, on my first hike coming back, because I ended up at the back of the group, the guy who had the gun to kind of cover us from the rear was actually helping me a bit as well, particularly when I half slid down a bank and managed to just catch myself. But then I was in a rather peculiar yoga position. So anyway, that's something that you'll see, and that's why those people are there. And then the trackers themselves take you to the gorillas. So in our case, we had to leave our walking sticks behind. We had to wear a mask because of COVID. And then the guys took us up to the gorillas. And the briefing was, if a gorilla comes up to you, sometimes this might be a silverback or it might be another gorilla, just stand still. So you're standing when you encounter them normally, and look at the grass, just study the grass. And that happened to me when a young male came up to me, kind of not a charge, but came up quite fast to me. And I just stood there, and then he stopped, didn't do much, and then the guides told me to just back away slowly. So you never run. That's the one thing you never do. Really, with any wildlife, don't run. Certainly true with gorillas. So we would then gently back off and make sure that the gorillas were comfortable. Now, if you do go on these things, again, something we weren't told, but everyone expects to be tipped. And probably $5 is, if you're in a group, it's probably enough for most of these things, but it's good to budget for it. And we weren't told that, so we were, in a bit disorganized. So however you're doing the trip, do tip guides, and generally $5 to $10 is good enough because they don't earn much money. They might earn. I think somebody was telling us, we had dinner with one of the guides, and I think he was $140 a month was the equivalent of what he earned. So basically, these people are very badly paid by our standards of the West. So it is good to budget to give them something. So that was the main thing, really, and I think that applied to all of the hikes to a greater or less degree. So I did two for gorillas, one for chimpanzees. Chimpanzees, they were up in the trees all the time and moving, so it was pretty much impossible to get a good shot. We also had quite a hard hike to get to them, and we've been told this was kind of like walking in Savannah. It absolutely wasn't. It was walking through forest. It was up and down a lot, very, very slippery. And and that last one was very disappointing, given the amount of effort that had gone into getting to find the chimpanzees. To get almost no pictures of them at all was pretty much the story for all of us, except for one guy in I think it was French. We met up with another few people because they have normally a limit of 8 people, but they're trying to make it a group of 8 people when you go on these things. And I think he'd hung back by the river because he needed to pee, and chimpanzee came down and had a drink in the river, so he had quite a good experience, but that was sheer luck. And that obviously is the way of it with wildlife. You get lucky or you don't. And I must say that in my life, the things I've done, most of the time I've actually been very lucky. but every now and then your luck fails, and that was definitely part of it for me in Uganda. So, what else to say? The other there's a couple of other stories I'll quickly share from that trip. So, very much behind the scenes things. Um, so, on our final, where we camped near, or where we stayed near Queen Elizabeth National Park, it was not quite glamping, but it was sort of. So, there were these tents. They had covers around them, and they're on a kind of concrete plinth anyway, and so they're quite nice. It's not roughing it by any means, and the tents didn't have their own facilities, so there was a block of four showers and two lavatories. They were separate rooms, and then at the end of this block there were two sinks out in the open. So that's where we would go. This camp was actually very good. They had people out at night, so if you needed to go to the bathroom at night, you got out of your tent, you stood near it with your light on, either a head torch or your phone, and somebody would come over, because we did have animals going through the park. And in fact, or the camp area. And in fact, we found a footprint, or the other people I was with found the footprint, which they initially thought was a lion print, but when I looked at it, it was too small. So I've seen lion prints, and there's a couple of things about them. One is that they're bigger than my hand. When I put my hand on the ground and spread my fingers, a lion paw print is still bigger. These prints were smaller. The other thing was that I noticed at the end of one of the toes, there was a kind of circular mark, just almost a puncture mark in the ground, which looked like it had been made by a claw. So that told me that it was unlikely to be a lion, both because of the size, and also cats retract their claws when they're walking. The only cat that doesn't is a cheetah, because they can't fully retract their claws. Whereas dog type animals, I'll call them those, tend to have their claws out permanently. So you'll tend to see claw marks in their tracks. Now, the other clue I had was that, first of all, it had been raining when we arrived. So because this was in sand, it was any tracks prior to that were probably erased, most likely. And then that night later on, I'd heard hyenas. And in fact, that's what the track turned out to be from a hyena. But they were clearly walking through our camp. And the morning, we were out early to go and do this chimpanzee hike, actually. And one of the ladies in the group had found an elephant right next to the camp, and also a hippo. So she was really excited. But they kind of dragged her away to make sure she didn't get hurt by them, because they're both potentially very dangerous. Anyway, when we got back at lunchtime, this bull elephant was basically walking through our camp, eating the trees. So initially it was where we pulled up, and there was a covered area where people would leave luggage when they were coming and going, and everyone was standing under that as a way of, not upsetting or annoying the elephant. And I'd gone towards the front, and I was slightly outside, but only just. And I was pretty sure I was in the clear, and I wasn't creating any problem for the elephant, because it wasn't in musk. It wasn't. Often you can see male elephants, when they're like that, they have like a tear. It looks like, but it's actually caused by being in musk, and they tend to be very aggressive then. And the other time an elephant will be aggressive is if it's a mother with a young calf. So. Which obviously wasn't the case. So I thought I'd left enough room where I wasn't potentially blocking it either. Anyway, I'm looking at it through my camera, about to take a photograph, when I realised it was trumpeting and flapping its ears and waving its trunk and heading towards me. So I very quickly just got up from the crouch I was in, turned around, walked to the back reasonably quickly, but not running, of this cover. And that was it. It was over. But again, I said earlier, if you're in an encounter with an animal, it is a good idea in most situations not to run, because that will tend to encourage them to charge. But if you don't run, if you stay pretty calm and just try and get out of the way of them, that's generally what you need to do. So that was one story. In fact, later, this elephant walked right past my tent. So I was sitting in the chair outside my tent, and he walked right the way past, and another person was there, and I just sort of told her to get on the plinth, so she was next to the tent, so no problems. But the elephant was fine, didn't bother us at all. And I guess the final story I just wanted to share was a human story. So I mentioned this toilet block, and they had the sinks at the end, and that same afternoon where we'd gone to the chimpanzees and then the elephant. We'd had an afternoon off and we'd been having a beer and a chat and all that. It was a really nice afternoon, just chilling. And I thought, well, I'll go and get a shave. And I'm standing at one of these sinks, just more or less finished shaving. Still had some shaving cream on my face. And this old guy who worked there, he turned out to be one of the trackers, came up to me came up to have a shave at the next sink, and he asked me what I was using because he hadn't seen shaving foam before. So I told him what it was and asked him if he'd like to try it. So he said, yeah, and he washed off this soap he'd had on his face. So I sprayed a handful for him, and he's carefully putting it on and asking how long he had to leave it and all this kind of stuff. And then was sort of carefully having a shave with it. And I thought, well, I'm happy to give him the can, but I don't know if he likes it. Anyway, I sort of done. I washed off and dropped everything back in my tent and, got ready to just go off for dinner. And as I walked out of my tent and walked past, he was still there, carefully shaving at the sink. He had a big mirror there as well. So anyway, went to dinner, and then the two guys who were managing our trip, they came back. They'd seen this guy, and they were we were kind of laughing about it, and it was sort of funny situation. They said, "Oh, you really enjoyed it." So basically, but he'd actually left. He'd gone off to do something else, and I left these guys with my can of shaving foam so that they could give it to him when they caught up with him. They were going to see him again in a few days. So it's just a funny little story, just one of those little things. But it was quite nice. It was quite unusual, and it was just one of the nice memories from doing that trip. So although the focus was the animals, and that was what I was trying to do, was to get these animal pictures, I did meet and have great interactions with a lot of the local people. And I must say, when I've been in Africa, I find most people are very, very friendly, and it was definitely the case in Uganda, and if anything, more so. And even when we were in the 4x4 going through, on our way back or on our way to treks or whatever, hikes or whatever, obviously the kids will often just wave and shout at the four-wheel drive and at the passengers, but also I would just wave to people as we were going by. And some people, it was very funny. I remember an old guy was pushing his bike, and I just waved at him, and suddenly there's a huge smile, and he waved back, and he looked like he'd had quite a tough day. So you just don't know. You don't know what's going on in people's lives. You don't know what sort of day they've had. You don't know what difference it would make when a stranger just smiles and waves at you. So it can make a nice difference to somebody's day. So anyway, that's really this behind the scenes video podcast. Just some really thoughts and sharing some experience of it. And maybe there's some takeaways there if you're planning a trip or planning to go somewhere like Uganda or anywhere in Africa or elsewhere, where some of this may also be relevant to you. So I hope you've enjoyed that, and I will speak to you in the next podcast. So bye for now. Oh, and one thing just before you go, please take a look at the 2026 wildlife calendar. That's available now. It's on the website. There's a link below the description of this podcast episode. So please take a look, and I'll speak to you next time. Bye now.